Okay, cool. So we'll go talk about web scraping. I think this section is definitely called like HTML, CSS. Was it section 18? I think that's what it is. Yeah. Basically, it's the web scraping like part, and we've kind of been talking a little bit about data acquisition. Essentially, like if you think about like APIs, that's what we're talking about. I think we also we had talked about SQL and using SQL Alchemy. You can think of like these past couple sections being like data acquisition. So I think I mentioned this last time, is I kind of consider like having the data like through an API usually is like a pretty high bar, being like, oh, I have information, CSVs, or like some tabular data format is super useful too. That kind of goes along with SQL. And then as you get kind of lower down, like the bottom of the barrel would be like you going out and doing a survey yourself, which would just be awful because you have to go figure that out. But what's it called? I'd say like right above that, just barely, is web scraping. And you can hear like the terms people use, like data mining, web scraping, scrubbing. It's kind of considered like this dirty kind of like thing to do. So just kind of be aware, it's like this can be a lot of issues. Oh, I just realized I wrote this right here. Yeah, direct access, API calls, scraping the data, and then other sources are probably the last one. And the reason I say scraping the data can be the most is because ideally websites would be perfectly formatted and everyone uses this right syntax and everything like this. But the way HTML is, and the way sometimes people write websites, it is not super clean necessarily and not super easy to access. And I think I've told this story before. It's like literally like was going through, I think it was scraping the Olympics website for like information. And I was doing a whole bunch of things and I did a finalized version. And I was like, cool, I'm gonna run this the next day, just go through and scrape the whole website. Literally the next day, they changed the website and all my stuff didn't work anymore. So that's kind of the risk you take with web scraping. It's like things can change, things aren't what you expect. But it can be super useful because that's all the data that you can get from it. Okay. But in order to web scrape, we have to understand how to actually use HTML, how that is structured, and then also CSS, okay? And we'll talk about at the end some tools that we can use to actually do this web scraping so we don't have to literally do it ourselves, like literally copy and paste things in Command F, which I had done that before I knew full about data science, and finding something called Beautiful Soup, which we'll use, made life just 100% easier, and we'll see what that is. And you can automate stuff. Okay, so first thing, HTML. Have you guys done HTML before? Just thumbs up if you have done it before, or if you've seen a little bit. Have you seen, maybe not? No, okay. So HTML, basically it's just how the web is written, like more or less. So Markdown, like you guys have seen like me write like this, is actually based to make an easier HTML, but HTML is kind of like a general XML format. So, or not general, a specialized XML format. So it's written a specific way, but with XML, we had like these tags where like, okay, like this is like a note, and then everything within there is within the note, and then we have an ending tag. That's how HTML is structured as well. So you can see here, we have these tags, we call them, which are basically like, where we start something. For example, this is a paragraph tag. So say, okay, this is a paragraph. This is where it starts. And then we'll have the paragraph information and then an ending tag like this. Okay. So this is like the general structure of how HTML is structured. And we can do all these interesting things and structure and all this stuff. So for example, you can see here, what's cool is Jupyter Notebook actually directly supports Markdown, HTML. So we can actually write HTML elements just like this. So you can see here, for example, I have a paragraph tag. In this case, I have a heading tag. So you can see here, this is spaced out in a weird way. But you can see it kind of gives this weird heading. Or basically, it's giving this heading part and all this stuff. The main thing I kind of want to say about HTML is really great when you're new, in the sense that it's really forgiving, which makes it really difficult for you guys as data scientists trying to scrape it, because it's so forgiving, it tries to figure out when you mess up, and it might look fine, but then when you try to scrape it, we like to scrape things that are orderly and like predictable, but if it's not orderly, it might look fine or look well enough, and then when you try scraping it, you're like, wait, there's supposed to be an ending tag here, or oh, there's supposed to be this element in here. Thankfully, most professionally done websites are pretty good at keeping things consistent, but a lot of times when you want information, it might not be in the cleanest, best format. And of course it can change, okay? And so I guess I kind of skipped over this part, but when we talk about this HTML hypertext markup language, it's some people, like, I'm not trying to get any like like say it's not really a programming language, and it most people who, if someone says a programming language, people roll their eyes, say no, it's not. In a lot of ways, it really isn't. It's a markup language. It just basically tells you what things are. It's like XML. It's telling you a specific thing. It doesn't really have like that kind of structure like you would have with Python. But what's interesting is that it takes this specialized XML, essentially, this HTML, and a browser basically interprets it to something pretty and nice looking. So for example, if I go to like a website here, just a website, with Chrome, you can just do inspect, and other browsers, you have something similar with developer tools. But you can inspect, and you can actually see all the HTML that's built into here. So you can see here, it's basically XML, and you can see all these different parts and all their nesting and stuff like this. So what we're going to do when we scrape it, we're going to actually look for these different tags and these different patterns and actually pull information from this based on the structure of the HTML itself. And what's kind of cool is that this HTML tells the browser, in this case Chrome, tells the browser how it should display the information. But in reality, all your websites, when you look at this, are really just HTML. So kind of just know like that's really the backbone of like what you're seeing. Like this stuff right here is really described all through here. Plus things like CSS, and there's some other things like JavaScript which translate into HTML and CSS. But the main thing is basically HTML and CSS are like the markup language of the web. Cool. All right. So I wanted to say that before I moved on to the next part. But main thing is built up tags, just like XML is. Okay. The next part are attributes. And attributes are things that live with inside the tags. And those things basically, like you can think of your tags of saying whatever's between these beginning tag and ending tag, that is the thing. So for example, this is a paragraph. Like everything in there is a paragraph. It has like a header, like I showed in this one. Everything from here to here is a header kind of deal. And you can, like I kind of showed, this is not usually kosher, but like it still works. It doesn't crash. It doesn't stop your browser. It tries to figure out. For example, if I forget this guy right here, it's not going to crash or anything. It's just going to do weird stuff, like even though I didn't have an ending tag. So just know that, like, again, HTML, kind of like your browser tends to handle mistakes, even if they're not the best or even if they shouldn't work. Okay, but your attributes live within the tag. So for example, this right here is a hyperlink tag. Okay, so with the letter A, I don't actually know why it starts with the letter A. Probably just because it was so frequently used. But the important part, you can put these attributes within here, and they all have the same format. So you can see it lives inside the tag, the beginning tag, and they start with basically, this is the name of the attribute, and this is href, or href, which is basically its hyperlink reference. And so for this specific tag, it has this attribute, href equals google.com, okay? And this is right here, says, all right, this is the actual tag. So this right here is the actual hyperlink. This is the attribute for this tag. And what the browser does in this case will translate, all right, click here for google.com. You can see I have it written here. And I put HTTPS just so it actually maps to the right thing. And so basically it says, all right, here's the attribute for the tag, but this is the actual element within the tag. And so what happens here, this is actually a hyperlink where if I click on this, I'll go to google.com. Okay, so these are hyperlinks. These are pretty common. Important thing to note for attributes, I could actually put in attributes that don't, like, are not anything, like things that are not supported by, like, something random. For example, I put, like, you know, Adam equals hello. This is now officially an attribute, but it won't, the browser won't do anything with it. It doesn't have any information. It won't do anything interesting. And note that I can put multiple tags just like this, right? So you can have multiple tags in here. It always goes in the front tag. These tags might not have actual meaning, like browser meaning, so just kind of be aware of this. Also, these tags can later on, we'll talk about CSS. These basically signal, for example, like you'll see things like class. These signal to the browser to say, hey, these are specific types of elements, and basically allows them to reference those kind of things. So these will be really important, these attributes, class, and the other one's ID. These ones are really important to identify when we're web scraping, to figure out what does this HTML element actually represent. Okay, cool. Any questions on this attribute stuff? No? Okay, cool. It's kind of like metadata within a tag. So we have tags, we have attributes within that tag, and then the last thing we have are comments. Okay, so you can see here is that a comment starts with this, with a angled bracket, exclamation part, and then 2 dashes, and then it ends with 2 dashes and the opposite angle bracket. And that basically, this won't show up. Like if I were to run this, like if I were to get rid of these parts and I tried doing the HTML, it just won't show up, but it will still be within the code. Just like if I looked at inspect element here, I'm sure there's some comments in here. Maybe not. Yeah, never mind. Okay, there's no comments in here. But if there were comments in here, you would, oh, here they are, this green comment right here. This comment exists in the code in the HTML file, but it doesn't show up anywhere on the actual browser. So just know that those things can be there too. Usually these aren't really important. Usually we don't web scrape it off these comments because most times there aren't really comments, but just know that can exist there. Okay, so that's basically all of HTML. In the curriculum, they talk about a whole bunch of different tags. I'm gonna let you read through that versus me telling you what each tag does. I think I do actually have some elements on here, but I won't go into full detail. Like, it's just basically knowing what each part does. But I'll mention a little bit, but just kind of, there's a lot of references to say what tags that exist and everything like that. So what I want to show is your, what we call the DOM. And the DOM basically is your structure of how the HTML is. And when I said like HTML is like the backbone of the web, really it means that HTML files, like everything essentially, every time you go to a web page, it's a file essentially. And so basically each file is usually structured in this way, and this is called the DOM, the document structure essentially. Was it document object? Ooh, I can't remember now, but usually we just call it the DOM. Basically, you think of it like the document structure, okay? And note that there's this usual header right here, doc type HTML. The funny thing is this has never really changed, but it's there for kind of like backwards compatibility, where like maybe in the future, you know, and maybe new standards will change this. But as of right now, this is pretty much the only thing you would put up there. So just know that you'll see this pretty frequently. And then this allows us to also, tells the document, the browser I should say, to run HTML5, which is a new standard of HTML, which includes like new tags and stuff like that, different elements that you might not have had before, okay? But basically it comes down with the head, which is basically, it's not shown to the user, but basically it gives some metadata. It might give, for example, JavaScripts in there. It might define CSS, basically how to make the page look, like what the page should look like. That usually is contained within here, this head. And then we have the actual body, which is basically the content. And then you can see here we end it with an HTML tag. So these are the actual tags that you would see. And you can see they're nested within each other. Note with HTML5, they're new specific parts. For example, header, nav, meaning like a nav bar, footer, main, aside, article, section, canvas, and so much more. It used to be just body and head. Just know that these can be in, replace these parts or be added in conjunction with them. And again, because HTML is kind of really like loosey-goosey in a lot of ways, you might see people use it in different ways and maybe the improper way, even though it shouldn't be done that way. So just kind of know that when you're web scraping, there are different elements besides just head and body, and along with the common HTML elements, which I'll talk about in a second. Okay, but real quick before I go, does this make sense to you guys for the DOM? Basically, you have this heading part, which is like extra information that usually isn't displayed at all. And then the body is really like what you see. Okay. Cool, sound good? Yeah, sorry. See, I'm telling you this stuff, so not for you to make a website, but for you to be able to scrape a website, because in the end, that's what we really care about. Of course, if you want to build a website, you can definitely look this up online. There's plenty of stuff that will tell you how HTML goes through. But I'm not going to be that person because web development is not my forte. It's not something I enjoy. So common HTML elements though, paragraphs, headers, images, lists, okay? So basically you can think of your header as like this, like structured right here. For example, you can see like, you know, I have this header and then I have subheaders underneath that. That's exactly what HTML does. So it starts off with where's it go? Here's H1, and then there's H2, H3. By convention, they're supposed to represent H1 as the main header, H2 as a subheader of H1, and so on. However, again, not everyone does it that way. So again, be aware that even though that's the intention, there's not a restriction of saying that it has to be done that way. So you might see websites that use H1 or H2 in different ways that are not necessarily subheaders of each other, okay? Images is a pretty common one. So image tags this is a typical format. These are the only attributes that you really care about besides, we'll talk about CSS, but are specific to images is source, SRC, and it's basically the path to that file. And so this could either be like an HTTPS or HTTP, to some external website, or if you see something like this, it means it goes into its path of saying, all right, from wherever the file is right now, go into that folder, and within that folder, go into this image file, okay? So this would go, like if I were to have this on here, it would basically extend it. It's like, all right, let me go ahead and go into the folder of, what's it called? I'm trying to think if there's a good example I have. No, but it goes into that folder, and then within that folder is the actual image. So I'm going to show you really quickly with this is like the structure for through Jupyter Notebook. Well, let's see. I'm trying to think if we had a picture of something. Statistical distributions? No. I know we have them in mod 1. So let's go probability. Yeah. So in here you can see in probability I have images, and in this we have random number generator. So I believe I have it in statistical distributions. Yes, I do have it here. Oh, it's taking a second. Okay. So you can see here this is going to be HTML. If you can see this image, and then the source is images / random number generator. That basically is saying it's going into this file because the file is here. So it's going into that top level of images. And then in that images is the random number generator.jpg. So if I actually took this part, and really what's weird in Jupyter Notebook is like using HTML. So I can actually get rid of this part where the file exists and say, all right, inside probability, into images, and then random number generator, and I actually get the file in here. And that's what we're doing when we're web scraping for this folder path. That's what we're looking at. Okay, so we can go into that folder and get that file, basically where the path, or where the file exists in that path. Okay, that's where the source is, SRC for image. And then just note alt. Alt usually, well, alt should represent an explanation for like accessibility of saying like what the image is supposed to be. So this can be useful information. However, like I said, there's no real restriction in like how you can use HTML. So this alt can be used in creative ways that are not normally, like this is supposed to be for accessibility, and like when you hover over it, you can see it. However, there's one, for example, I know SKCD, they have an image here, and their alt image, you'll see there's a little hover thing, and it's not just, it's actually like a little side joke essentially when you hover over the image. And if I look in this, inspect this element right here, you will see that there's the image source, and then you can see there's an alt right here. Oh good, he changed it. He used to have it differently. He used to have the alt put in as his little joke, and he's changed it now. And this is HTML5. So good on him. I'm glad he made it for accessibility. But you can see here this alt is supposed to describe what that element is. In this case, diploma legal notes. That way it helps things, one, for people who like have a hard time seeing, or it can also be used for us as web scrapers or other systems where, you know, for example, voice assistants can possibly see what that image is and understand what it's supposed to be. Okay, cool. So that's images. So this is probably one that you probably like scraping a lot of. You might scrape a lot of images, for example. So it's good to know how this is structured. Okay, and note that for images, like, let me go back to that one again. In images, the ending tag, you don't necessarily need, you can see, oh, there it is. You don't need to have a ending tag. So it's just image all by itself. Sometimes you'll see like an image, you see how it's image like this. You might sometimes see image like that. That tends to be an older convention. Most of the time you'll just see image just like this. Okay. And this is one of the few ones that are actually just like a single tag. Cool. And the last one is list. A list, obviously, you can have like, you know, bulleted list or a numbered list. So unordered lists are like bullets. An ordered list are numbers. Okay. So you can see basically we have UL representing unordered list, and then each one is a list item. So this would be coffee, pickling, UL, and all that stuff. So for example, if I got rid of this, you'll see unordered list, coffee, vinyl records, pickling, ordered, and all that stuff. Or that's because I have this part. But the point is like this right here is saying, oh, it's a list. Okay. And if I have ordered list, this will automatically number it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It doesn't, at this point, it will always count from 1 downward. You don't have to worry about like the numbers stuff like this. But usually this is meant to be in a specific order. Okay. And you can see, if I go back to here, you can see that it's just the list element, list element, list element, all nested within the ordered list or an unordered list. Cool. Any questions on this guy? All right, this is really good for like, oh, okay, good. This is really good for like getting information that is ordered, for example, recipes. You might see something like this, like if you run a scrape a lot of recipes or something along these lines, you might have something along this way. One that we'll typically like to find are tables, because for data scientists, for obvious reasons. So I'm not gonna go through the whole thing, but there's a whole lot of complexity you can make with tables. And just know that the first thing is your table element. So it's like, all right, this is a table. That's what this whole thing is saying. It's, all right, everything in here is a table. And then the next thing in here, these are, how do I say this? The TR is like your table row. Okay, so like TR table row. And so each one of these TRs represent, so this code right here represents down here. TR represents a table row. And we also have this, within the table row, you can either have TD or TH, and the H represents header, the D represents data. So if you have a TR and then TH within it, that would mean that's a header. And you can see in this case, the browser understands to make this bold. Depending on like CSS or other decorators, you can make this all nice and pretty however you want. But the important part is we just care about the data itself and not how it looks, is that basically that TR says it's a table row, TH says what header it is, okay? And then going further, if you have another table row, you might have something, for example, multiple data points in there, okay? Or data, sorry, data items within that. Okay, and you can see here, I did kind of change this part just to kind of show you something. So this is a little bit different, but if I went ahead and got rid of this, oops, I'm just going to show you guys that way. You can see here we have our full code right here, and that's exactly what it looks like. You see each data item 0, data 0, like this. Okay. Cool. And this is data that we usually like. We like this kind of format, obviously, as data scientists, because it means like, oh, cool, we can grab that and put it into like a CSV format or some tabular format data. This one is kind of funky if you look at it, is that we can actually have the table, the specific row span multiple parts. So for example, we can have the table row span equals 2. So it spans multiple rows. Or you can even have something like the header, or it doesn't have to be the header, but it could be the header, the column. So this one will span 2 columns. Instead of having 1, 2, 3, you can see now it spans over 2 columns in total. So these are different ways that it can be set up to make tables. And you can see that this might have a different kind of, like knowing the structure of the table is important. And again, there's no strict rule of exactly how it should be done. So you might see poorly formatted tables like this kind of deal when you're web scraping. Okay, cool. Any questions on table rows or sorry, table elements? Cool. All right. So last thing, just HTML5. Just know there's a bunch of different tags like I mentioned before. And it used to be the div tag, which is like this general encompass tag. And in fact, if I look here, you probably will see div right here, div. HTML5 expanded div. So instead of having a generic just container, you now have different things that say, oh, it's a header, it's a nav, it's a footer, it's a side, it's an article, and all these things. Some of these work in browsers, some of them don't work as of now. So just know that they might be already put on there, but they might look differently on the actual website. So as a scrape, like if you're doing scraping, just know that these things exist. Okay. And usually if you're scraping a large amount of data, usually each web page looks very similar. And so you can, once you know the structure of one web page, you can apply that to many other web pages. Okay. So that is all HTML pretty much. Quick, in a nutshell. So this leads us to CSS, which basically we don't usually scrape along CSS, but just know that CSS allows you to do like visuals. So it'll take an element right here and you specify basically by the element or by the class, which is an attribute within. So you can see here class. Okay, so this case, this attribute of paragraph has a class of robot.text and friend. So they have two different classes. Okay, or you can specify by ID equals this. So you'll usually see a lot of elements within HTML have class or ID used. So going back to this example, you can probably see there's a class here, an ID class right here. And that helps to identify for the website and then later on for the HTML really to identify what piece is which is helpful for you as a web scraper to understand what thing you're looking for. So for example, ID equals comic, you can see this part right here, is that it's like, oh, if I know every web page is looking for ID comic, I can just say, all right, find the div with ID equals comic, and I will know what the structure looks like. So for example, if I go to a random thing, let's see if it does it. Oh, these are one of those older ones, so this might not work, so let's see. So you can see here, okay, so ID equals comic. So you can see here is that every web page on his website that has a comic on here has this kind of format. So I can quickly find those comics within there and scrape, this specific website. Cool. All right. And just know CSS, I'm not going to really talk about too much, Chrome talks about it, but just know that it's a way basically to select items and do specific visual changes for it. All right. But we won't usually scrape it for CSS, but it's related to how we do finding the class and ID. All right. So any questions you guys have about HTML, CSS that I kind of went over? Maybe I went through too quickly, or you might know something about it.
I got one question for the HTML image. Could I see the coding of it again?
Mm-hmm.
Just because when I'm working in the Jupyter Notebook, I just wanted to see if there was a way to put the images inside the workbooks.
Yeah. So you're talking about like things like this, right?
Yeah, being able to place it in.
Yeah, let me show you. So like this, for example, I have for another cohort, you can see I just have the image and then the source. In this case, this top one just points directly to external website. See this part right here. And then also have, and the alt basically just the hover over, but you don't necessarily need that if you're just putting in a Jupyter Notebook. But the alt is meant for like accessibility. And then you have if you wanted to source it specific to like a local image that's on your same directory, you basically say, okay, within that same directory, you kind of like imagine you're in this folder right now, in this case, probability one, or probability, and then you go into the folder images and then find the file. So if I go to my workbook here, this is my actual file I'm working on, right? It's distributions. It's within this folder images, random number generator.
What if, is there a way to source it from like a photos folder, a pictures folder in your
like
personal?
Like further up and stuff like that?
Yeah,
something you can't do. And this is where it might get kind of tricky, depending on what. The problem is if you don't have full accessibility to that permission, especially for Windows, you might not be able to, but let's see. Let's see if we find another image somewhere. I know I have one somewhere.
Yeah, because I'm trying it out now and it just becomes empty. Like it just becomes a blank line.
Yeah, so let's see if I can show you an example. Come on, I get it.
You're trying to go up a directory into another folder, Adam?
Yeah. Well, from my personal computer's photos folder.
Usually you have to use, I think it's .. to go up a directory and then go back down into the folder you have to that you're trying to get into where the picture is.
Yeah, so let me show you, Adam. So if you do image source, and so I'm going to go into this directory, which is one level up, so in SQL. So I'm going to go, the original is in probability, or mod1 probability. So if I go up by ... it would go up into mod1. Then I'm going to drop down into SQL, this directory, and then drop into SQL, go into images, and then from images get data schema. Okay. So what that would look like within here is going to be ... /SQL / images / that the name of the file, and that will be my image. So that should work. See that? And I have that SQL database image. So you can look at this, the way you can test it is if you copy this guy right here, and get rid of the name of the file. If I place this directly in here, you see the .SQL images, it should go to that image. Yeah, I don't care. There. So
Okay.
I see, I think, is that Josh put it? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you,
Oh
Josh.
yeah, thank you. That developer MoveZilla.
MDN, yeah, that's like one of the first resources. I've done a course on Udemy, so that was something different. But
Yeah, there's a lot more you can do for web development in general that can be useful, even if you're not going to do web development. Understand how websites are built and stuff like that can be really useful. Okay, cool. So
Thanks.
no problem. I know it's a little off topic, but that's all right. So cool. So that's all of HTML that I'm going to talk about. There's more resources, obviously, like Josh, you put out the MoveZilla website, and there's a bunch of things you can kind of look into and see what works well. So actually, let's go there real quick just to kind of show you. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of information like the web technologies, right? Like different like ways to, oh good, like references guides. It's actually be able to see like, for example, how tables work. So you can see, oh, there it is. Okay. And it's kind of nice because it can tell you how it works and different ways it can be treated, which is useful for you as a data scientist to understand how people might make a website, right? And understanding what are the implementations. So for example, when you should not use HTML tables. Again, things that people technically shouldn't do, it doesn't actually stop them, right? It'll still try to process it through. So note, for example, if you get to an old website, people used to, instead of using like correct spacing and padding, you would build tables and you would put elements within the tables. So this is really, really old school, but you might still see that depending on what you're scraping. So for example, sometimes when people go from academia, they've only learned stuff that they learned in the 90s and have decided never to change. It's possible. So anyway, cool. Fun fact, HTML, I believe, was developed, I think, through physicists trying to basically link papers together and stuff like that. So cool. All right.
A physicist.
Those physicists, you know, messing everything up. Okay. So this goes into web scraping. So I'm going to show you briefly some web scraping here. And the curriculum, again, goes through a lot. Basically, the idea is we go through the DOM, right? Model. That's what it is. Document Object Model. I always forget this. I always call it the DOM. I never think of it as object model. But basically, no, is that we're basically going to go through the model, the structure of the DOM, right? That's really what we're talking about. And so we talk about it as like siblings, children, descendants. You can think of like nesting and stuff like that, kind of similar to how we talked about recursion with XML. Because I mean, if you looked at HTML, it basically is XML, right? Just a specialized form. Okay, so we have this beautiful, beautiful package called Beautiful Soup. Okay, and this one right here is really popular in Python. I like using it. There's other packages you can use as well. But I personally like Beautiful Soup because it's just, maybe it's the first thing like I really came across and I realized I'm like, oh, web scraping just became a lot easier. But I believe this is what the curriculum shows too. We're going to do import requests like we talked about before. That way we can actually use requests to grab a website. So we talked about this during APIs, okay? And regular expressions. We haven't really talked about regular expressions, but this allows you to essentially, what's it called? Allows you to do general formats of strings. So you can look, for example, like, well, I'm looking for something that has something, something, bus, something, something number. You can use regular expressions to look for that. Something's like, well, it's going to be something, the word bus, something, and then like a number. You can actually specify that with regular expressions. Really powerful stuff. I tell myself every year I'm going to learn regular expressions, and I never do. So if you ever take the time to do this, it's kind of like, it's kind of got this interesting format, but just know that's what we can use to basically search through the document a lot easier. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run this guy. So I get all my libraries, and then I'll basically define this. This is directly coming from Beautiful Soup. So first of all, I get my web page. So I'm going to define this function. You don't have to do this, but I like doing it because it makes it a little easier for me to read. Is I do something called get soup. So that's what we kind of call HTML when it's being read into Beautiful Soup. It creates like a soup, which is basically like a dictionary list structure format, which kind of very Pythonic and allows you to go through it a lot easier than compared to this HTML structure. So I'll get the web page, which is using request to get it from that URL. and I'll return basically this web page and beautiful soup. And basically this is going to get the soup for web page content, which is this web page, right? So basically what is the web page actual file look like? And I'm just specifying HTML.parser. I think the default is HTML parser. I could be wrong, but you're wrong. I can't read that, of course, because Jupyter Notebook sucks. No, I was kind of blocking it. But anyway, you can use other parsers. I think there was an XML parser you could use too. So I think technically you could use Beautiful Soup to parse through XML. I could be wrong. But note, this is basically just a big long string, essentially this web page content, okay? And so I'm returning this part so I can get the page, the URL, and the actual soup, okay? So I define this function, and then you can see my normal tuple. You guys have seen this before, right? When you can return like a tuple like this and then unpackage it like this. Yeah? Okay, cool. I'll make sure I wasn't showing you guys something different that I haven't shown before. So now I have the web page, which should be Android Police. This is a random website that I go to sometimes. And soup, which is the soup of that web page now. So for example, if I go to that page.content, which would just basically be this right here. Like I said, this is just a big old string. So you can see here, it's a big old string of the actual web page. And you can see that web page is huge, right? It takes a long time. If I go to Android Police, just to kind of show you what this actually looks like, you can see it's a bunch of articles, okay? And some ads, but like a bunch of articles essentially, all structured like this. I can read more and read more of the articles. There's a little blurb here. So you can see this is a really great one, for example, if you wanted to scrape, because it has the same format every single time. So I can go through this a lot easier, okay? So go back to web scraping. Okay, so that's my web page content. So like that's kind of cool. That's nice, but now it's kind of not super useful. So I can actually use the soup, and the soup basically structures it in this nice format. Like right now, it's kind of cool that Beautiful Soup says, oh, when you do soup, it'll print out this nice, beautiful structured format of HTML, all nice and put, versus the string where it's just like white space, forget it. It just puts it all together. This basically makes it all nice and pretty on the web page. But what's nice is that I can actually use the soup to find things and actually go through the document beyond just like looking at it and appreciating how HTML looks. So for example, if I want to parse the page, I can actually get all the images. So for example, if I want to get all the images, I do soup.find all, and this say what kind of tag I'm looking for. In this case, I'm looking for the image tag. And I do this, and I say, all right, now these are all the images. And so I can see how many images are there. But there are, oh, I didn't print this out. 74 images. So 74 images, not as many as I thought there would be. But the point is that you can actually get each image, and you can see here, this image is one, allows me basically get that first tag, or that first image and that first tag. And you can see here, here's the image, the class, the source, right, going through here. And for example, I can go ahead and do, I believe I can just do source like this. Oops. Duh. You can see here, I get the source. So I can actually go to this. So I think I could just go like here. Oops. The keyboard's off kilter. There we go. And so it's cool. I can click on here. Look at that. Our first image. And we saw from Android Police, that was one of the pictures. Do you remember? You can see that's the first image that shows up. So you can basically go through those parts. And you can basically sort through classes. So for example, if you just wanted, let's see what, yeah, gosh, what's wrong with me today? Images, one, oh, it's not the first image, it's the second image, whatever. You can see, for example, the class image hero. So if there's a specific reason why we want to use this class, we can get just the ones that are just this class, basically using this structure here. And we can go from there and get those specific ones, get all the images, and all that stuff. So we can iterate through this and basically get all the images that we want very, very quickly. Okay, cool. So again, that was pretty simple. Like you can see, once I have the soup, it's pretty easy to find all those images. We can also find other elements, for example, find all the divs, which might be useful if I'm looking for an article structure. For example, if I'm looking for the first 10 divs, I can very quickly look and say, all right, what are the different divs, which are basically like the different nesting areas. And you can see, oh, there's containers. There's basically 16 columns. Like, okay, this is probably more structure. And I might find something, oh, look, here it looks something like, exit, okay. Like, I'm like, all right, this is just like a link to basically exit, going through here. Okay, this tip wrapper right here is like, okay, is this something interesting? Close, nope, 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 nope. Ah, we're getting something interesting here, some logo. So you can kind of quickly go through this and see what you might want to find and what things are actually like useful to you. Okay. So once I have the div though, you can have nesting within itself, right? So we can actually do things like, for example, go to the fourth div, find the next siblings, which are basically like, it's things that are at that same level. So like if you imagine one nest inward. So if I look at, let's say Android police, sorry. I got a sneeze. Okay. For example, like let's say I have this div and I go within this div. Oh, that's not a good example. I'm trying to find something that actually has like multiple. Oh, this should have it. Okay. So let's say I go here and there's multiple divs. There we go. So you can see here within this div, I get to this div and I want to find all the ones that are in here. So I get to this div, it's like, oh, I want to find one that's also at that level. For example, these are probably like all the articles. So you can see this is an article. That's an article. I can find its siblings. Basically, everyone's at that same level. So that's what this dot find siblings are. So I can actually get all the ones that are at that level. In this case, it's not really useful because I just picked a random, div. But the point is, you could find all of that, all of those divs that are at that same level. And then you can do some more complicated. For example, instead of just finding all things that are div, I would say, well, find everything that is a class container. So I might do, for example, go to this website and say, all right, let me see like what this is, and you can see, let's see the class, and maybe there's a container in here or something that looks interesting that I want to specifically get. So now if I go here, I can say, all right, get the div with the class container, then find all. And you can see here, I can say, oh, there's 11 of them. So for example, if I do D, you can see quickly, like, okay, what things have containers in here? And you can see here, it's like, oh, there's different references, different containers. If I wanted to go something specific, I'm trying to do something on the fly before we end. So we have this guy, which is h2, div, post header box. So let's do a post. So class post. So now what will happen is that I'll get everything that is a class. Oops, I didn't really need that one right here. This wasn't needed. But I can find everything that has a class post that is a div. And you can see there's 10 articles, and I can now see what that D is. And so for example, I can see that very first class right here. Okay, and you can actually go in there now. So for example, if I do like D0, I'm trying to see what the first thing is in here. Let's say A. Nope. Oh, it's not the first one. So the point is that you can basically find these different parts and actually get within there. It's within the header. But the point is that you can basically go into the DOM and structure and find the parts that are relevant to you. And that's kind of like how you can do this web scraping. And actually, once you have that as like whether it's text or a string or a URL, you can then use that to either store it for later or go to the next part and so on. So you can automate a lot of this stuff. But you can see already like the little stuff I've been doing. You can see how this can take a lot of work and take a lot of time. But if that's the only way for you to get the data, it can be really useful information that you can get. All right, awesome. So that's kind of all I had to show you guys for web scraping in terms of HTML and CSS as well. Do you guys have any questions?
No? Nothing for me. Just should be interesting going through this section. So
yeah, it's kind of a fun thing to do. It's kind of like digging for buried treasure, but like making a robot do it for you. But the problem is, it's like the hard part is not digging for the treasure, it's making the robot to dig it properly. That's kind of like what I view it.
Right.
All right, cool. So I'll go ahead and stop the recording here.